Eleanor Hayes pressed her last coin into the palm of a trembling old man, bleeding alone in the summer dust, while every fine lady in Richmond gathered their skirts and walked around him. She did not know his name. She did not know his blood. She only knew that a human being was suffering, and no one cared enough to stop. That single act of defiance against every rule polite society had written for poor women like her would crack open a world she never knew existed. If you believe kindness still matters, subscribe to this channel, follow this story until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Richmond, Virginia. Summer 1815. The heat that July was the kind that made honest people mean and cruel people worse. Eleanor Hayes had been awake since before dawn. She always was. Sleep was a luxury that belonged to women who did not owe money to half the merchants on Market Street. She was 24 years old with calloused fingers and a back that ached from bending over a sewing frame 6 days a week. And she had learned the way poor women always learn things slowly and through humiliation, that the world was not designed to notice her. She was not pretty enough to catch a rich man's eye, not bold enough to demand what she deserved, not connected enough to be included in the conversations that decided who in Richmond rose and who stayed buried. She was to most of the town simply invisible. And on most days, Eleanor had made a kind of peace with that. She dressed in the same faded blue cotton dress she had let out twice at the seams, and repaired so many times the original fabric was more patch than cloth. She braided her brown hair low against her neck because ribbons cost money she didn't have. She carried her sewing basket on one arm and kept her eyes forward and her chin level, because the moment a woman like her looked uncertain, the town noticed and closed in. She owed 6 months of back rent to Mr. Aldridge, whose patience was famously short. She had 4 garments to deliver by sundown, or she would not see payment until next week, which meant she would not eat anything but cornbread for the 2nd week in a row. And she had promised herself, the way she promised herself every single morning while staring at the ceiling of her single rented room, that today would be the day she finally gained enough ground to breathe. That was her plan. The summer road had other intentions. She was halfway down Broad Street, moving fast, cutting between the slow-moving carts and the clusters of women in better dresses than hers when she saw him. An old man standing completely alone in the middle of the road, not sitting, not resting against a fence. Standing, right in the path of oncoming horses and wagon wheels, stock still, as though the entire world around him had simply ceased to make sense. He was richly dressed. Anyone could see that. The coat on his back was fine wool, dark green, the kind that cost more than Eleanor made in 3 months. His boots were polished, or had been before the dust of the summer road got to them. His white hair was combed. His cravat was neatly tied. He was in every visible way a man of considerable standing, and he was utterly profoundly lost. Not lost the way a man is lost when he's taken a wrong turn. Lost the way a person is lost when the map inside their mind has gone suddenly blank. His hands were shaking at his sides. His eyes moved from face to face in the crowd around him, with an expression Eleanor recognized immediately because she had seen it once before on her own father in the last months of his life. Terror. Not the sharp terror of a man who sees danger coming. The quieter, deeper terror of a man who no longer recognizes the world he has lived in for 70 years. People passed him. That was the thing Eleanor could not stop staring at even later, even when she thought about that afternoon over and over. People passed him, dozens of them, women in silk, men in good coats, merchants who surely recognized a wealthy gentleman when they saw one, boys running errands, a reverend walking slowly with a Bible under his arm. Every single one of them went around him. A woman in a yellow dress actually clicked her tongue as she steered clear as though the old man were a broken cartwheel causing inconvenience. 2 young men laughed. Eleanor heard one of them say just loud enough to carry, "Old money gone soft in the head. Happens to all of 'em eventually." The other one laughed harder. Eleanor stopped walking. She stood there for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for her better judgment. The voice in her head that sounded like every practical survival-minded thing she had ever had to teach herself to say. "You are already late. You cannot afford another setback. You do not know this man. This is not your problem." 3 seconds. Then she walked toward him. "Sir." He did not look at her right away. His eyes were still moving through the crowd, searching faces that were already turning away from him. "Sir," she said again, and she stepped directly in front of him, so that he could not look past her. "Are you all right?" He looked at her then, focused on her. And for a moment, she saw something sharpen in his eyes, just a flicker, the way a candle flame pulls itself back from the edge of dying. "I know this road," he said. His voice was deep, still dignified, though his hands had not stopped shaking. "I have walked this road my entire life. I know every building on this street." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said. She kept her voice low and steady, the way she'd learned to speak to her father. "I reckon you do. But I cannot." He stopped. His jaw tightened. Eleanor watched him fight for the words, the way a drowning man fights for the surface, and she felt something in her chest break open just a little. "I cannot recall," he finally said, "where I was going." "That's all right," she said. "That happens to the best of folks in heat like this. Where do you live, sir? Can you tell me that?" He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not embarrassment exactly, more like grief. The quiet grief of a man who is discovering in real time that a thing he has always possessed is no longer entirely his. "Carter Estate," he said finally. "South of the city. My family has held it since—" He stopped again. "Since before the war." Eleanor knew Carter Estate. Everyone in Richmond knew Carter Estate. It sat on 300 acres of Virginia farmland and had produced more tobacco and political influence than most men in the county would see in 3 lifetimes. The Carter family name was the kind that appeared on the sides of buildings and at the top of donation lists at church, and in the careful, respectful way that people lowered their voices when they discussed money. She had never in her life had cause to think about that name as belonging to an actual person standing in front of her. "All right, sir," she said. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm going to walk with you, if that's agreeable." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him evaluating not with cruelty, but with the automatic wariness of a man of his station encountering unexpected kindness from a stranger in rough clothes. "I do not wish to trouble you, Miss Hayes," he said. "No trouble," she said. And then, because she did not know what else to do, and because the sun was blinding and he was still shaking, she simply offered him her arm. He looked at it. Then slowly he took it. His name, she learned as they walked, was Jonathan Carter. He was 71 years old. He had come into Richmond that morning to speak with his solicitor about something he could not at the moment recall what, and somewhere between the solicitor's office on Main Street and the road back to where his driver was waiting the afternoon had simply slipped. "It has been happening more," he said quietly. They were moving slowly now, out of the main current of foot traffic, toward the shade along the edge of the road. "My son does not know the extent of it. I have not told him." "Why not?" Eleanor asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because William has carried enough," he said. She didn't push. She'd learned with her father that some things needed to be offered, and some things needed to be left alone. She walked him back to the inn on the east end of Broad Street, where his driver had apparently been waiting for 2 hours, increasingly alarmed. The driver, a large man in his 40s named Thomas, who looked as though he had spent those 2 hours trying to decide whether to search the whole city or send word to Carter Estate, first went visibly pale when he saw his employer walk around the corner on the arm of a young woman in a faded work dress. "Mr. Carter, sir." Thomas started. "I am perfectly fine," Jonathan said with a dignity that nearly broke Eleanor's heart. "This young woman was kind enough to assist me." Thomas looked at Eleanor. His expression was a complicated mixture of relief and professional uncertainty, the look of a man who did not know how to categorize what he was seeing. "Miss," he said carefully, "on behalf of the family." "It's quite all right," Eleanor said. "I only walked him back. It was no great thing." "It was," Jonathan Carter said. He had turned to look at her directly, and his eyes, which had been so frightened on that summer road, were steady now, clear. It was a very great thing, Miss Hayes. In a street full of people who saw a man in difficulty and chose to look elsewhere. He paused. You stopped. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't accustomed to being seen at all, let alone seen as having done something worth naming. Anyone would have, she said. They did not, he said. You did. She left them there. She was already more than an hour behind her deliveries, and she spent the walk across town trying to calculate whether she could make up the time, knowing she couldn't, telling herself it didn't matter, knowing it did. She did not expect to think about Jonathan Carter again. She was wrong. 3 days later, a letter arrived at her rooming house. She nearly didn't open it. Letters that arrived for Eleanor Hayes were usually bills or the rare and deeply unwelcome notice from Mr. Aldridge about the rent. This one was sealed with dark green wax pressed with an emblem she didn't recognize, and the handwriting on the outside was precise and masculine and entirely unfamiliar. She opened it, standing in the hallway of the rooming house, still in her work apron, with Mrs. Patton's cat winding around her ankles. Miss Eleanor Hayes, my father has spoken of you every day since your encounter on Broad Street. He is not a man who speaks easily of kindness received, and yet he has mentioned your name each morning at breakfast with a consistency that has impressed upon me the significance of what you did. I would consider it an honor if you would accept an invitation to take tea at Carter Estate at your earliest convenience. My father has expressed a specific wish to thank you properly. Respectfully, William Carter. Eleanor read it twice. Then she looked up at the water stain on the hallway ceiling that had been there since before she moved in, and thought for a long moment about everything she knew about the Carter family, and everything she knew about women in her position who accepted invitations from families like that. She thought about the look on Jonathan Carter's face when she'd stopped in the road. The terror, the grief, the way he'd said, "You stopped," as though it were the most remarkable thing he had encountered in years. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She went the following Thursday. Carter Estate was exactly what she had imagined, and nothing like it at the same time. She had pictured something cold and formal, all marble and distance, and the quiet machinery of enormous wealth operating in ways she wouldn't understand. And all of those things were present, yes. The drive alone was longer than the entire block she lived on. The house itself was white-columned and imposing. The gardens were immaculate in a way that spoke of constant attention by people who were paid not to be seen doing the attending. But the house also felt in a way she couldn't quite name empty. Not empty of people. There were servants visible at a distance. A groundskeeper moving along the far edge of the lawn. A woman who was probably the housekeeper standing at the side entrance watching Eleanor's approach with an expression of careful neutrality. Empty of something else. Of warmth, maybe. Of the particular quality of a house where people were genuinely glad to be. She was shown into a formal sitting room and left to wait, which she did with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, and her chin level, the way she always held herself in rooms that were designed to make her feel small. Jonathan Carter arrived first. He came in ahead of his son, moving carefully but with purpose. And when he saw her, his entire face changed in a way that Eleanor found unexpectedly affecting. Not the polished smile of a wealthy man greeting a social acquaintance. Something more like relief, like a man seeing a familiar landmark after a long period of being lost. "Miss Hayes," he said, "you came." "I did, sir," she said. She started to stand. He waved her back down. "Please." He settled into the chair across from her with the deliberate movement of a man whose joints did not cooperate the way they once had. "My son will be along directly. He was detained by some matter about the East Field. He is always detained by some matter." A pause and something wry moved through his expression. "He is a very serious young man. He was not always quite so serious, but life tends to do that." "And how are you feeling, Mr. Carter?" Eleanor asked. "Since last week." He considered the question with more honesty than most people offered. "Better," he said. "Today is a good day. There are good days, and there are days when the fog comes in." He looked at her steadily. I trust you to understand what I mean by that. I do, she said. My father had similar struggles in his last years. Jonathan nodded slowly. Then you know that the hardest part is not the forgetting itself. It is the moment just before, when you can feel something slipping and you cannot catch it. Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly it. They sat with that for a moment, the way two people can sit with a hard truth when neither of them is pretending it isn't there. Then the door opened, and William Carter walked in. She had not known what to expect of him. The letter had told her almost nothing, only that he was formal, correct, concerned about his father. She had half imagined someone older, someone who had been shaped by his estate into something rigid and remote. He was 34, she would learn later. He was tall with his father's dark eyes and none of his father's ease. He had the look of a man who had spent years making sure no room ever saw him uncertain and who had gotten very good at it. His coat was dark blue, his cravat perfectly tied, his expression as he entered the room carefully composed into something that passed for welcome without committing to warmth. He looked at Eleanor the way a man looks at something he hasn't decided how to categorize yet. She looked back at him with exactly the same steadiness she brought to every room that made her feel like she didn't belong in it. Miss Hayes, he said, thank you for coming. Mr. Carter, she said, thank you for the invitation. He sat. A servant appeared with tea things poured, disappeared. William Carter looked at his father and then back at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't entirely read. My father tells me, he said, that you walked with him for nearly half a mile in the heat. It wasn't so far, Eleanor said. He tells me that you spoke to him calmly, that you did not treat the situation as an inconvenience or an embarrassment. His voice was even, neutral. He tells me that you simply helped. He needed help, Eleanor said. It seemed the obvious thing to do. Several dozen other people on that road apparently did not find it obvious, William said. She didn't answer that because there wasn't much to say. She took a sip of her tea and waited. William Carter studied her. Not rudely, but thoroughly in the way of a man who has learned that the distance between what people presented and what they actually were could be considerable. Miss Hayes, he said, I'll be direct with you if you'll permit me. I prefer it, she said. I don't know what you want, he said. People who do kind things for my family generally want something. That's not a statement about you specifically, it's an observation about how things tend to work. I'd rather name it plainly than pretend the question isn't there. Eleanor set her teacup down. Mr. Carter, she said, I want to finish my sewing work and pay my back rent and eat more than cornbread twice a week. I want my father's memory to rest easy wherever he's gone. Those are the things I want. She looked at him steadily. Your family's money is not among them. William Carter was quiet for a long moment. His father across the room made a sound that might have been a laugh. I told you, Jonathan said to his son. Didn't I tell you? William looked at his father. Something moved through his expression, not quite softened, but shifted. Like a man adjusting his footing on uncertain ground. You did, he said. He looked back at Eleanor. The careful neutrality was still in place, but something underneath it had changed in a way she couldn't have named but could feel. My father, William said, has asked me to offer you a position, if you would be willing to consider it. He paused. As a seamstress for the household. We have regular need of that kind of work. The pay would be fair. Eleanor looked at him, then at Jonathan Carter, who was watching her with an expression of careful hope. That's generous, she said. It's practical, William said. We need the work done. You do the work. William, his father said mildly. It would also. William continued with a slight adjustment in tone that might have been an apology of sorts. Allow my father to have company that seems to settle him, which is not something money can buy. So I am being direct about the fact that this arrangement would benefit us as well as you. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about her rooming house and her back rent and the cornbread and the long nights of calculating what she owed and what she earned, and how far the gap between them seemed to grow, no matter how hard she worked. She thought about the look on Jonathan Carter's face on that summer road. The terror. The relief when she stopped. She thought about the way William Carter had just looked at her. Not the dismissal she was accustomed to, not the cool sliding away of attention that happened when people in Richmond realized she had no money and no family name worth speaking of. Something more like evaluation, as though he had not yet made up his mind about what she was. She picked up her teacup. "When would you like me to start?" she said. She started the following Monday. The work itself was straightforward enough: household linens, clothing repairs, occasional pieces for the domestic staff. Eleanor was good at her work, and she knew it, and the practical satisfaction of doing something well was one of the few reliable pleasures available to her. So she threw herself into it with the kind of focused energy that made the housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, revise her expression from polite skepticism to something approaching respect within the first 2 days. But it was Jonathan who changed the shape of her hours there. He had it emerged, developed a habit of finding her. Not intrusively, not in a way that created difficulty. But in the late mornings, when the heat had settled into the rooms and the house had gone quiet around him, he would appear in the doorway of whatever room she was working in, knock lightly on the frame, and ask if she minded company. She never did. He would sit in the chair near the window while she worked, and he would talk. Not about the estate or his son, or the business of his life. Those things seemed to exhaust him. He talked about his wife who had died when William was 12, and about the early years of the estate, when everything was smaller and hungrier, and full of the particular aliveness of a thing being built. He talked about the summers he remembered from his childhood, the taste of river water and the sound of his mother's voice calling him in before dark. On the good days, he was lucid and present, and his stories were rich and specific. On the harder days, the same story might appear twice in an afternoon, slightly changed, and Eleanor would listen to both versions with the same attention, because she had learned with her father that what mattered was not the story, but the act of being heard. William, she noticed, did not often sit with his father. Not from coldness, she could see that clearly enough watching them when they were in the same room. William Carter was not a cold man. He was a man who had spent a long time managing things, including his own grief, and he had not yet learned that managing and presence were not the same. When he appeared in the doorway and saw his father talking quietly with Eleanor, something would cross his face quickly, too quickly to name, and then he would find a reason to leave again. She didn't comment on it. It wasn't her place. But she watched. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks into her time at the estate, that she heard the voice. She was in the upstairs workroom when a man she didn't recognize arrived in the entrance hall below. The voice carried up clearly a large, confident voice, the kind that had never spent a day worrying about whether it would be heard. "Carter." A pause. Footsteps. "Where is that boy hiding himself? I've ridden 20 miles in this heat, and I'll not be kept waiting in a hallway like a tradesman." She heard Mrs. Briggs's careful response, too low to catch. Then the voice again. "Tell him Charles Whitmore is here, and that we have business to discuss. Important business, the kind that doesn't wait." Eleanor set down her work. She had heard that name. Everyone in the county had heard that name. Charles Whitmore owned the largest parcel of land east of the Carter estate, and had a reputation built on the certainty that he was right about everything, always by virtue of the simple fact that he had been right about enough things that people had stopped arguing with him. She heard William's voice then coming from the study, also carrying, though with more control, "Mr. Whitmore, come through." The door of the study closed. Eleanor picked up her work again. 20 minutes later, she heard raised voices. Not screaming. Men like Charles Whitmore did not scream. They simply increased volume in a way that was designed to feel like gravity, like something you were sinking under rather than something aimed at you. But the anger in it was unmistakable, and it was directed at William, and it was about her. A seamstress Carter. A seamstress with no family, no position, no property installed in this house where she is in daily contact with your father. She works here, Whitmore. She has gotten herself access to an old man whose mind is failing. The voice dropped slightly, took on a different quality, more careful. I am telling you this as a man who has your family's interests at heart. I appreciate your concern, William said. His voice was level, carefully level. The matter is under control. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a woman with nothing to lose has managed to make herself indispensable to your household in less than a month, and you don't seem to find that troubling. I find it useful, William said. My father is calmer, he sleeps better, he eats. What specifically is your objection? A pause. My objection, Whitmore said with the deliberate patience of a man who is deciding to be obvious, is that my daughter has waited 2 years to be formally introduced to you. That I have been patient because I understand a man of your position has many considerations, and that I am considerably less inclined to continue being patient when I ride over here and discover a woman of uncertain background has made herself comfortable in your home. Silence. Your daughter, William said, is a perfectly fine young woman. She is, Whitmore said. She is also a match that would consolidate the 2 largest landholdings in this county. That is not a small thing. No, William said. It is not. Another silence. Longer. I see, Whitmore said, and the temperature in his voice dropped noticeably. Then let me be equally plain. The seamstress goes, or my goodwill goes with her. And I have rather a great deal of goodwill in this county, Carter. It would be unfortunate to lose it over a woman who sews buttons. Eleanor's hands had gone very still on her work. She heard William Carter's voice quiet and final. I think we've covered everything that needed covering today, Whitmore. Thomas will see you out. A beat, then the sound of a door. Then silence. Eleanor sat with her sewing in her lap, and her hands still, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. She heard footsteps on the stairs. William's footsteps, she had learned them in 3 weeks. The particular cadence of a man who was always moving toward something that required his attention. He stopped outside the workroom door. She waited. He knocked. Come in, she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame, and for a moment he just looked at her with that same evaluating expression he'd had in the sitting room the first day. Except this time, there was something different in it. Something that had not been there before. She looked back at him steadily. I reckon you heard that, she said. I reckon you did as well, he said. She nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. Miss Hayes, he said finally, I want you to know that nothing that was said downstairs changes anything about this household's position regarding your employment. I appreciate that, she said. I also want to say, he stopped. For a man who was clearly accustomed to having words available to him, he seemed to be struggling with these particular ones. What Whitmore said, about your background, your position. He met her eyes. I want you to know I don't hold with thinking about people that way. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Carter, she said carefully, you looked at me the very same way when I first sat down in your parlor. He didn't flinch. I know, he said. I was wrong to. She had not expected that. She looked back down at her work. Well, she said, I appreciate that as well. He didn't leave right away. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and she could feel him there, that solid, careful presence, the way you can feel weather changing before it arrives. My father, he said, told me this morning that you remind him of my mother. Eleanor looked up. William's expression was not soft. It was too controlled for that. But something in it was open in a way she hadn't seen before. Something that looked from a distance like a door left slightly ajar. He told me, William continued quietly, that she was the only person who ever made him feel that who he was mattered more than what he owned. He paused. He said that was the rarest thing he had ever found in a person. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the Virginia summer pressed its heat against the glass, and somewhere on the grounds, a mockingbird was running through every song it knew. Eleanor Hayes sat in the upstairs workroom of Carter Estate in her repaired blue dress, with her calloused hands and her basket of sewing thread, and she understood with the clarity that comes before a thing is fully known that the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She did not know yet what it was shifting toward, but she had learned the way women who have survived on their own always learn to pay very close attention to the moments when the world rearranged itself. This was one of those moments. "Your father," she said at last, "is a remarkable man." "He is," William agreed, and then quietly, "So was she." He stepped back from the doorway. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes." "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." His footsteps moved back down the hall. She listened to them go. Then she picked up her needle and her thread, and she went back to work. But her hands, when she looked at them, were not entirely steady. And the mockingbird outside the window sang on and on into the long Virginia afternoon, as though it had all the time in the world to say what it needed to say. The mockingbird was still singing when Eleanor came downstairs the next morning. She had lain awake most of the night thinking about William Carter's voice in that doorway. Not the words, she had turned those over enough times to know them by memory, but the quality of silence that had followed them. The way a man who was accustomed to having the last word had simply stood there, letting her have it instead. She had told herself it meant nothing. Men of his position said generous things when they felt guilty. It was one of the luxuries available to people who had never had to mean everything they said. She had almost convinced herself of that by the time dawn came. Almost. She arrived at the estate early before the household had fully woken, and Mrs. Briggs met her at the side entrance with a cup of coffee and an expression that said she had something to report. "Mr. Jonathan had a difficult night," Mrs. Briggs said. "He was confused after supper, tried to go out to the south field at midnight. Thomas found him at the fence line." Eleanor set down her basket. "Is he all right?" "He's resting now. The doctor came before dawn." Mrs. Briggs paused, smoothing her apron in the way she did when she was choosing words carefully. "Mr. William hasn't slept. He's been in his father's room since 2 a.m. Eleanor looked toward the stairs. "I won't disturb them," she said. "No." Mrs. Briggs agreed. Then, after a pause, "He asked for you, though. Mr. Jonathan. When he came back to himself around 5 this morning, the first thing he said was, he asked if Miss Hayes was coming today." The coffee cup was warm in Eleanor's hands. She looked at it. "Tell him I'm here," she said. She found Jonathan in the chair by his bedroom window, wrapped in a blanket. Despite the summer heat, his white hair uncombed for the first time since she'd known him. He looked smaller than he usually did. Not diminished, the dignity was still there, still present in the set of his shoulders, and the careful way he held his head, but scraped. The way a person looks when the night has taken more than it gave back. William was in the chair on the opposite side of the room. He had not changed his clothes. His cravat was loose, his coat discarded somewhere, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that had nothing to do with the morning light. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted, not quite relief, but close to it. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Carter." She looked at Jonathan. "Good morning, Mr. Jonathan." The old man turned toward her voice. When he saw her, the tight set of his mouth eased just slightly. "You came," he said. "I said I would." She pulled a chair to his side and sat down close enough that he could see her clearly without strain. "How are you feeling?" "Foolish," he said. An old man wandering around his own field in the dark like a lost calf. He paused. "I knew where I was. In the moment I was perfectly certain I knew. And then I look up, and Thomas is standing there with a lantern telling me it's the middle of the night and I've been walking for an hour." "That must have been frightening," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What frightens me," he said with the deliberate honesty of a man who had decided there was no longer any use in pretending, "is not what I don't remember. It's what I might do while I don't remember it. What harm I might bring to this house." "You haven't brought any harm," Eleanor said. "Not yet," he said. Across the room, William made a quiet sound, not a word exactly. more like something pressing against the inside of his chest, finding a small way out. Jonathan looked toward his son. "You should sleep, William." "I'm not tired," William said. "You have not slept in 24 hours. I'm aware of that. That is an extraordinary level of stubbornness for a man who tells me regularly that I am too stubborn." Something crossed William's face, the ghost of an expression Eleanor had not yet seen on him. Something almost like the person he might have been before everything he was carrying got so heavy. "I learned it somewhere," he said. Jonathan made the sound again. This time it was definitely a laugh. Small and tired, but real. Eleanor sat between them and felt the particular texture of a family that loved each other and did not know how to say so, and she thought about her own father, and she looked at the space between this man and his son and understood it the way you understand something you've lived inside yourself. She picked up Jonathan's hand and held it gently. "Tell me about the South Field," she said. "Why do you go there?" He looked at her. "How did you know I go there? Mrs. Briggs mentioned you've been found out that direction more than once." "Ah." He was quiet. "My wife is buried there, at the edge of the tree line under an old oak tree. We planted it together the first year we were married." A pause. "I go to talk to her." Eleanor did not look at William. She didn't need to. "What do you talk about?" she asked. "William mostly," Jonathan said. "She worried about him even at the end. She said he had too much of me in him, too much weight and not enough light." He moved his thumb slowly across the back of Eleanor's hand. She was nearly always right about things. The room was very quiet. Then William stood abruptly, and his chair scraped back, and he said quickly, like a man getting ahead of something, "I need to check on the morning work. I'll be back before noon." He left. Eleanor heard his footsteps on the stairs faster than usual. Jonathan watched the door. "He cannot sit still when something moves him," he said quietly. He never could. When he was 12 years old and his mother died, he spent an entire week fixing everything on this estate that had needed fixing for years. Repaired every fence, cleaned every stall, rebuilt 2 sections of the garden wall. He paused. When he was done, he came and sat with me for one evening. Didn't say anything, just sat. His grip on Eleanor's hand tightened slightly. That was the closest he could get. Eleanor looked at the empty doorway. "He'll come back," she said. "He always does." Jonathan agreed. "That's the thing about William. He always comes back." A pause. "He just doesn't know yet what he's coming back for." It was 2 hours later that Eleanor found William in the barn. She had gone looking, though she told herself she hadn't. She'd told herself she was simply cutting through on her way to the kitchen garden to return a basket to Thomas. She had not examined that explanation too closely. He was standing at the far end of the barn with his back to her, both hands resting on a fence rail, looking at nothing she could see. She stopped at the entrance. "Mr. Carter." He didn't turn around. "Miss Hayes." She should have left it there. She knew that. There was a whole architecture of appropriate distance between her position in this household and his, and she had lived inside that architecture her whole life, and she knew exactly how it worked. She walked in anyway. She stopped a few feet behind him. "Your father told me about your mother," she said. "About the oak tree." He was quiet for a long moment. "He talks about her often, every day," Eleanor said. "Not always the same things, but always her." William's hands shifted on the rail. "She died when I was 12. I don't think he has been entirely whole since then. The estate, the work, the management of everything, I think that's been what he built in the space she left." A pause. "And now the work is becoming harder for him too." "He's still himself," Eleanor said. "On the good days, he's completely himself. And on the bad days, he's walking fence lines at midnight thinking it's afternoon." William's voice was even, too even. The evenness of someone who has been keeping their voice that way for a very long time. "The doctor says it will progress, that there will be more bad days and fewer good ones. I know, she said quietly. I don't... He stopped, started again. I don't know how to help him. I know how to run this estate. I know how to manage property and settle disputes and keep this family solvent. I do not know how to sit in a chair and just be with a person. Eleanor looked at the back of his head. Yes, you do, she said. He turned then. He looked at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, as though the sleeplessness and the worry had worn through whatever he normally kept in place. You sat with him all night, she said. You didn't leave. That is exactly how you be with a person. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them moved for a moment that was 3 seconds long and felt like considerably more. Why are you here, Miss Hayes? He said. Not unkindly. Not the suspicious version of that question from their first meeting. A different kind, quieter. More genuinely curious. I work here, she said. You know what I mean. She considered. Because your father asked for me this morning, she said. And because I understand what it is to watch a parent slip away, and someone was kind to me when that was happening, and I thought... She stopped. I thought I could do the same. He was very still. Who was kind to you? She thought of her neighbor, Mrs. Calhoun, who had brought soup every evening for 3 weeks and never once made Eleanor feel that accepting it was charity. A woman in my building, she said. She brought food. She sat with him sometimes so I could sleep. She never said a word about any of it afterward. What happened to her? She moved away. Her daughter in Charleston. Eleanor smiled slightly. She was a very practical woman. She would not have considered herself to have done anything remarkable. William looked at her for a long moment. People like that never do, he said. No, Eleanor agreed. They generally don't. Something settled between them. Not intimacy too careful for that, and both of them too aware of the particulars of their situation, but something. The particular atmosphere that forms when two people have stopped negotiating and started actually talking. I owe you an apology, William said. You've already given me one, a different one. He turned back to the fence rail, but his posture had changed, less rigid. When I wrote that letter and invited you here, I told myself it was purely practical. My father needed a calming presence, and you had provided one, and I was simply organizing resources. That's what I told myself. And now, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. Now I think I was also testing you, he said. To see if you'd arrive with something you wanted from us. To see if the kindness on that road was real or strategic. And your conclusion, she said. He looked at her directly. I have never met anyone less strategic in my life, he said. It's frankly alarming. Eleanor surprised herself by laughing. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in longer than she could easily calculate. He looked startled. Then something shifted in his face carefully and slowly into something she might eventually call a smile. There it is, she said, because she couldn't help it. There what is, he said. Whatever you look like when you're not managing everything. He looked away. But the expression stayed. That afternoon, Charles Whitmore returned. Eleanor heard his horse on the drive from the upstairs workroom and felt her shoulders tighten before she knew why. Then she heard his voice at the front door, that large gravitational voice, and she understood. She went on sewing. She heard William meet him in the entry hall. She heard Whitmore speak in a tone that was lower this time, more deliberate, more calculated. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Whitmore said. I came on too strong, I know that. I'm a direct man, Carter, you know that about me. I do, William said. I want what's best for this county, for both our families. A pause. My daughter Caroline is a thoughtful young woman. She's been well educated. She would be an asset to this house and to the management of an estate your size. I'm sure she would, William said. I'd like you to come to supper, next Friday, just a meal between neighbors, no pressure, no formality. The voice smoothed out deliberate. And I'd ask as a neighborly thing, one gentleman to another, that the household arrangements here be returned to whatever they were before last month. Silence. The seamstress, William said. The seamstress, Whitmore confirmed. A beat. She stays, William said. The quality of the silence changed. Carter. My father's health is my first responsibility, William said. Miss Hayes is good for his health. That is the end of the discussion. It will not, Whitmore said carefully, be the end of the discussion in this county. Then I'll deal with that when it comes, William said. Enjoy the ride back, Whitmore. It's a fine afternoon. Eleanor sat very still in the workroom. She heard Whitmore leave. She heard the particular sound of a man departing, angry, which has its own distinct rhythm, the clipped footsteps, the way the door doesn't quite slam but comes close. Then she heard William's footsteps on the stairs, and she looked down at her work, and she focused on the needle and the thread and the very small specific task of putting one stitch after another. He knocked. Come in, she said. He opened the door and stood there, and she could see by the set of his jaw that the conversation downstairs had cost him something. Not his position, he had held that without question. But the ease of his morning, the tentative opening of whatever that had been in the barn, had been interrupted by the reality of what it meant to be William Carter and to be making choices that Charles Whitmore disapproved of. He'll make trouble, she said. She wasn't asking. Probably, William said. I can find other work, she said, if it becomes a problem for the estate. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it. He cleared his throat. Miss Hayes, I have already told you, your position here is not contingent on Charles Whitmore's opinion. She looked at him steadily. And when he starts telling people that I've taken advantage of your father's condition, then people will meet at my father and see for themselves that he is calmer and more lucid than he has been in a year, and they will draw their own conclusions. You have considerable faith in people's fairness, she said. No, he said. I have considerable faith in my own position in this county, which I intend to use in this instance to say something true. He met her eyes. That a woman who has shown more care for my father in 6 weeks than most of his social circle has shown in 6 years is exactly where she ought to be. Eleanor looked back at her work. She pressed her lips together for a moment. That was a very fine speech, she said. I've been rehearsing it since the drive. She looked up at him. He was almost smiling again, the guarded version. The version where the smile was visible, but he was keeping a hand on it. Go rest, she said. You've been awake for a day and a half. I'll rest when... Mr. Carter. She looked at him with the firm patience of someone who had learned exactly how to handle stubborn people, because she had grown up surrounded by them. Go. Sleep. Your father is comfortable. Your estate is not on fire, and I will be here when you wake up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Yes, ma'am, in a tone that was entirely without irony and somehow carried the weight of an entire conversation. He left. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She pressed one hand flat against the sewing in her lap and breathed. The needle in her other hand was trembling slightly. She looked at it, made herself be still. Outside the window, the Virginia summer went on hot and merciless and full of everything growing. What nobody in Richmond had accounted for was that Charles Whitmore was efficient. By the end of that week, Eleanor knew it. She could feel it in the way the merchants on Market Street looked at her. In the way Mrs. Patton at the rooming house mentioned carefully that she had heard some talk. In the way that 2 women she had sewn for over the past year suddenly could not be reached when she sent messages about work she had in progress for them. Whitmore had not said anything dramatic. He had not needed to. He had simply mentioned things, to the right people, in the right rooms, with the careful neutrality of a man who was only sharing his concerns. And those concerns passed along through the usual channels had done exactly what he intended. A poor woman alone with no family name and no property gaining access to the Carter household, taking advantage of an old man's confusion, inserting herself. Eleanor had heard versions of this story before, not about herself, but about other women in her situation. She knew exactly how it worked and where it ended. She had believed for years that if she was careful enough and quiet enough and precise enough, she could stay below the level at which this kind of story found her. She had been wrong. She found out about the worst of it from Jonathan. He had been having a good morning, lucid and present, sitting with her in the garden, while she worked on a piece of embroidery for Mrs. Briggs. He had been talking about a horse he'd owned 20 years ago, a bay mare with a contrary disposition and excellent sense, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression that was very clear and very direct. "I've heard what Whitmore is saying about you," he said. Eleanor kept her eyes on her embroidery. "Mr. Jonathan, don't." His voice was firm. "Don't manage me. I'm having a good day and I want to talk about this." He leaned forward slightly. "He's telling people you're a fortune hunter, that you've cultivated my friendship in order to position yourself in this household." "I know," she said quietly. "It isn't true. I know that too. What I want to know," Jonathan said, "is what you intend to do about it." Eleanor looked up at him. "What can I do?" "More than you think," he said. "A woman who does not defend herself teaches everyone around her that she doesn't need to be defended." He held her gaze. "You stopped in that road when you didn't have to. You came here when you didn't have to. You have sat with me through days that my own son found difficult to witness." He paused. "You are not a woman who lets things happen to her. Why are you letting this happen?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Because if I argue," she said, "it looks like I care what happens to my position here. And if I care what happens to my position here, it looks like Whitmore is right," Jonathan finished. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I see the logic," he said. "I don't agree with it, but I see it." He settled back. "Do you know what I've learned in 71 years of navigating men like Whitmore?" She waited. "They expect silence," he said. "Silence is what tells them they've won. They are very much less certain of themselves when someone simply continues." He looked at her. "Continues being exactly who they are, without apology, without explanation, just continues." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Your wife," she said. "Did she do that?" Something moved through his face, warm and old and still after all these years entirely present. "Every single day of her life," he said. She looked back at her embroidery. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. And then, with the timing of a man who had once been very good in a room, "Well, that and the embroidery, I think you've got the roses crooked." "I do not have the roses crooked." "The left one." She looked at the left one. It was fractionally crooked. "Don't say anything," she said. He smiled. It was a good smile, the kind you earned. William found out about Whitmore's campaign the same way Eleanor had in pieces, from multiple directions, with the particular unpleasantness of discovering that a battle had been going on around you for days without your knowledge. He came to the workroom that Thursday with his jaw set and a letter in his hand. "My solicitor," he said, holding up the letter, "has received a formal query from 3 members of the county board regarding, and I quote, the employment of persons of uncertain character in proximity to vulnerable members of prominent families." Eleanor looked at the letter. "Whitmore drafted that himself," she said. "The phrasing is his." "I know." William set the letter down on the table. "I want to be honest with you about what this means." "It means he's escalating," she said. "It means he has more influence on the county board than I had appreciated," William said, "and that he is willing to use it." He met her eyes. "They cannot compel anything. My household is my affair. But they can make this uncomfortable, publicly uncomfortable. For you," Eleanor said, "or for me, for both of us." He paused. "Mostly for you." She nodded. "If you want to go," he said, "I will understand it. I will find you good work elsewhere, references that protect your reputation." His voice was careful, even. The voice of a man laying out terms, fairly even when the terms hurt. "I will not let this damage you if I can prevent it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the rooming house, and the cornbread, and the merchants on Market Street who were already not looking at her. She thought about how long she had spent being careful, being quiet, making herself small enough to survive. She thought about Jonathan Carter saying a woman who does not defend herself teaches everyone around her that she doesn't need to be defended. "I'm not leaving," she said. William went very still. "Miss Hayes." "I have not done anything wrong," she said. Her voice was steady. "I helped a man who needed help. I took honest work when it was offered. I have done my job and I have been kind to your father, and I have not asked for a single thing that wasn't owed to me." She held his gaze. "I will not leave as though I have something to be ashamed of." The silence stretched out. "It will get worse before it gets better," William said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Whitmore doesn't give up." "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her. And something in his expression, the careful management, the controlled distance, all the architecture of a man who had spent 20 years deciding not to need anything shifted. Not collapsed. Shifted. Like a door opening an inch. "No," he said quietly. "I don't reckon you do." He picked up the letter, folded it, put it in his coat. "I'll deal with the board," he said. "I know you will," she said. He turned to go. "Mr. Carter." He stopped. She looked at him, this serious, sleepless, complicated man, who had called her by her given name once by accident, and had been carrying the weight of everything alone for long enough that he'd forgotten it was supposed to feel different. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me leave." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for not wanting to." Then he left, and Eleanor Hayes put her needle to her work, and her work to her hands, and she sat in the summer heat of the upstairs room of Carter Estate, and she did not leave. She continued. Just exactly as Jonathan Carter had said she should. She continued. Eleanor continued. That was the word for it. Not fighting, not defying, just continuing. Every morning she arrived at Carter Estate at the same hour. Every day she did her work with the same precision. Every afternoon she sat with Jonathan and listened to whatever the day had brought him, whether that was clarity or fog or something in between. She did not flinch when she walked through Richmond, and felt the altered quality of attention that Whitmore's quiet campaign had produced. She did not apologize to merchants who looked past her. She did not explain herself to women who had stopped meeting her eyes. She continued. It cost her more than she let on. The 2 clients who had stopped answering her messages were not the last. By the second week after Whitmore's visit, 4 women who had previously given her regular sewing work had found other arrangements. The money she earned at Carter Estate covered her rent and left her enough to eat, but only just, and the margin between sufficient and not was thin enough that she felt it every time she calculated her week. What was harder than the money was the silence. She had grown up in Richmond. She had built over years of careful, honest work a small but real reputation as someone reliable and skilled. That reputation was being quietly dismantled piece by piece in rooms she wasn't in by a man she had never wronged. She did not tell William any of this. She told Jonathan. Not all of it, but enough. Because Jonathan asked her directly one Tuesday morning with the clear, precise attention of a good day, and she had learned by then that lying to him, even by omission, felt like a specific kind of wrong. How bad is it? He said. Manageable, she said. Eleanor. She looked at him. He had started using her given name 2 weeks ago in the same accidental way William had, and unlike William, he had not corrected himself. She had not asked him to. I've lost most of my outside work, she said. 4 clients, probably more to come. He was quiet for a moment. And in Richmond, when you walk through town. People look, she said. They look the way they look at something they've been told to disapprove of, but aren't entirely certain why. Does it make you want to leave? Every morning, she said honestly. And then I get here, And you tell me something ridiculous about a horse or your wife's opinions on gardening, and I remember why I'm staying." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. His hand resting on the arm of his chair turned palm up, not demanding, just offering. She put her hand in his. "I owe you more than I know how to repay," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it a debt." She didn't answer that. Some things didn't need an answer. From downstairs, they heard the front door open. William's footsteps in the entry hall, the low exchange with Thomas, the particular sound of a man arriving from somewhere difficult. He had been in town that morning. She hadn't asked why. She had learned to wait for what William Carter chose to offer because pushing produced only more careful management, while patience occasionally produced something real. Jonathan heard the footsteps too. He looked toward the door with the practiced attention of a man who had been listening to his son's footsteps for 30 years. "He went to see the county board," Jonathan said. Eleanor looked at him sharply. "He didn't tell me that." "He didn't tell me either," Jonathan said, "but I know my son." William appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. He had changed his coat. His jaw was set in a way that told Eleanor the morning had not been simple. He looked at his father first. "How are you?" "Better than you by the look of it," Jonathan said. William crossed the room and sat in his usual chair, the one across from his father, the one that had become his place in this room, the way certain chairs become certain people's places over time, through repetition and habit and something quieter than either. "The board meeting," he said, "was instructive." "Instructive how?" Eleanor said. He looked at her. Something in his expression said he had decided to tell her the full version, rather than the managed one. She recognized the shift by now, the slight loosening around the eyes, the way his hands stopped being quite so still. "Whitmore has 3 board members who follow his lead without question," William said. "A 4th who is uncertain. The remaining 2 sided with me on the principle that household employment is not board business." He paused. "The formal inquiry has been dropped." "But," Eleanor said. "But Whitmore is now circulating a petition," William said, "among the larger landowners in the county, questioning in very careful language whether the Carter family's management decisions remain sound given my father's health." The room went very quiet. Jonathan's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "He's questioning your competence," he said. His voice was flat. "Tangentially," William said. "He's framing it as concern for the family. He's using my illness," Jonathan said, "to undermine your authority." "Yes," William said. A muscle in Jonathan's jaw moved. Eleanor had not seen him angry before, not really angry, not the hot, still anger of a man who has been genuinely insulted. She saw it now. It aged him and sharpened him at the same time. "Over my dead body," Jonathan said quietly. "That is," William said with a care that didn't quite conceal how much it cost him to say it, "precisely the leverage he intends to use, eventually." Another silence. Different in quality from the last one. This one had weight. Eleanor looked at William. "What happens if the petition gains enough signatures?" "It cannot compel anything," William said, "legally, but it can influence opinion. It can make it harder to conduct business, to maintain relationships, to—" He stopped. "It can make it harder to continue." "To continue what?" Jonathan said. William looked at his father. "Everything," he said. Eleanor watched the 2 of them sit with that. Father and son separated by a room that had held decades of things they hadn't known how to say to each other, looking at a problem that Whitmore had constructed specifically to use what they loved against them. "He did this," she said, "because you wouldn't dismiss me." "Yes," William said. "Then the answer is obvious," she said. "I should—" "Don't," William said. His voice came out sharper than he intended. He heard it. He set his jaw. "I told you, that is not how this resolves." "William," she said, "I am not worth this. Not the petition, not the board, not—" "Miss Hayes." He turned and looked at her directly, and there was nothing managed in his expression now, nothing controlled. Just a man who had made up his mind and was being honest about it, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. I need you to hear me clearly. The question of whether you stay in this household is not a negotiation. It has been settled. What we are discussing now is how to manage what Whitmore does next. Eleanor held his gaze. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. She looked away first. "All right," she said quietly. "Then what do we do?" What they did in the end was Jonathan's idea. He proposed it that same afternoon over a late lunch that nobody was eating much of, with the particular clarity he sometimes accessed on good days. A strategic clarity, the mind of a man who had built a considerable estate from a modest start, and had not done it by being passive. "The petition is about perception," Jonathan said. "Whitmore is telling a story. The story is that this family is compromised and cannot be trusted to manage its own affairs." He looked at William. "The answer to a story is a better story." "What story?" William said. "The real one," Jonathan said. "Which is that your father is reasonably well. Your estate is managed soundly, and the young woman in your household is there because she is good at her work and good for this family." He set down his fork. "Whitmore's power is in the fact that people in this county have not seen for themselves. They are working from his version of events. And you're suggesting," William said slowly, "that we change that." "I'm suggesting," Jonathan said, "that you invite them to see." Eleanor looked at Jonathan. "The summer gathering?" she said. He nodded. It was an annual event. She had heard Mrs. Briggs mention it. A large outdoor gathering at Carter Estate, a tradition going back decades attended by most of the prominent families in the county. "It was last held 2 years ago," William said. "Before Father's condition. Before I became convenient to worry about," Jonathan said without bitterness. "Yes, which is exactly why holding it this summer sends the right message." He looked at his son. "You invite the county. They come. They see me. They see the estate. They see Miss Hayes as she actually is, rather than as Whitmore has described her." He paused. "And Whitmore has to attend because not attending the Carter summer gathering would itself be a statement he doesn't want to make." William was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor watched him think. She had learned to read the quality of his silences. This one was not resistance, it was calculation. He was moving pieces, accounting for variables, finding the weaknesses in the plan. "It's a risk," he said. "If it goes badly." "Things are already going badly," Jonathan said pleasantly. "At least this way we have a say in how." William looked at Eleanor. "What do you think?" She was surprised he asked. She shouldn't have been. He had been asking her things with increasing regularity over the past weeks, with the particular directness of a man who had decided her opinion was worth having. But it still surprised her each time. "I think," she said carefully, "that your father is right about the story. But I also think that putting me in a room with the entire county creates a target." "Yes," William said. "Whitmore will use it." "Yes. And whatever he does in that room I cannot—" She stopped. "I need you to understand that I will not perform gratitude for an audience. I will not stand in the corner and smile and make myself small so that the county feels comfortable about my presence in your house." She met his eyes. "If I am there as I am, which is honest and direct and not particularly trained to manage a room full of people who have already decided what they think of me." William looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's exactly what we need." The gathering was set for the last Saturday in August. The 3 weeks between the decision and the date were the most complicated of Eleanor's time at Carter Estate, and they were complicated in a way she had not anticipated, not because of Whitmore, but because of William. Something had shifted in him after the conversation at lunch. She wasn't certain she could name exactly what. He was not suddenly warm in the way of a man who had dropped his guard entirely. He was too much himself for that, too formed by years of careful distance. But the careful distance had become something else, something more deliberate, as though he had examined the space between them and made a conscious choice about it. He started finding reasons to be in the same room, not intrusively, not in a way that crossed any line she was aware of. He would arrive in the upstairs workroom with a question about some household matter that could have been directed to Mrs. Briggs. He would sit with her and his father in the garden and contribute to the conversation rather than departing from the doorway. He began to stay for supper on the evenings she worked late, a thing he had not done in the first weeks of her employment. And he talked, not about the estate, not about management or property or the logistics of his considerable responsibilities. He talked about his mother slowly in pieces, the way you approach something that matters too much to rush. He talked about the years after she died, when the house had felt too large and too quiet, and he had been 12 years old and furious with everything for being as it was. He talked about his father and the particular difficulty of watching a man who had always seemed immovable begin to move. Eleanor listened. She was good at listening. She had always been good at it. It was, in her experience, the thing most people needed, and the thing least often offered to them. And she talked too. More than she usually did. She told him about her father, the man he had been before the illness, steady and principled, and possessed of a dry humor that she had inherited, and which most people found slightly alarming. She told him about the sewing work, and why she had chosen it, which was not for lack of ambition, but because it gave her hands something to do while her mind worked, and she had always needed both going at once. She told him one evening about her mother, who had died when Eleanor was 7, whom she remembered mostly as a quality of warmth and the sound of humming in the kitchen. William had been quiet for a long moment after that. Then he had said, "I'm sorry. 7 is too young to lose something like that." "Any age is," she had said. "Yes," he had said, "but 7 is particularly unkind." It was not a romantic conversation. Neither of them reached for each other or said anything that couldn't be said in a well-lit room with the door open. But it was the kind of conversation that changes things, that builds something without either person quite naming what's being built. Jonathan watched all of it with the careful, pleased attention of a man who sees something coming together that he had hoped for but not counted on. One morning, during a clear and unhurried hour, he said to Eleanor, "He has not talked about his mother to anyone since she died." Eleanor kept her eyes on her work. "I know," she said. "He told you things about himself," Jonathan said. "William does not do that." "I noticed. He is not a man who—" Jonathan paused, choosing words with care. "He has been alone for a long time. Not from lack of opportunity, from lack of the right person." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I see what is happening, and I am not troubled by it." Eleanor put down her needle. She met the old man's eyes. "Mr. Jonathan," she said, "I work for your family." "You do," he agreed. "What you're describing, what I'm describing," he said, "is my son for the first time in 20 years sitting in a room and actually being in it, rather than managing it from a distance." He tilted his head slightly. "I find that I care more about that than I care about the propriety of how it came about." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "He hasn't said anything," she said. "He won't," Jonathan said, "until he's absolutely certain. That's William. He will carry a thing for a very long time before he sets it down in front of someone." He paused, "but he will set it down." She picked up her needle again. Her hands were steady. She made sure of it. "We should focus on the gathering," she said. "Of course," Jonathan agreed serenely. "Let's talk about the gathering." Judd. 4 days before the gathering, the first direct blow landed. It came not from Whitmore himself, but from Mrs. Aldina Crane, whose husband sat on the county board, and who was in her own quiet way considerably more effective than Whitmore at the kind of damage that left no visible marks. Eleanor was in the dry goods store on Market Street when Mrs. Crane walked in with 2 other women. Eleanor had not seen Mrs. Crane since the beginning of summer. She had sewn a tablecloth for her the previous winter. Mrs. Crane saw Eleanor, processed her presence, and turned to her companions with a slight increase in the volume of her voice, the kind of increase that is not accidental. "I heard," Mrs. Crane said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, "that the Carter gathering is to go forward this year despite everything." One of her companions made an uncertain sound. "Despite everything," the other said with the perfect pitch of a woman who knows exactly what she's feeding. "Well," Mrs. Crane said, "one does wonder about the wisdom, given the state of things at the estate, given the changes in staff." A gentle pause. "One can only hope the family knows what it's doing." Eleanor did not move. She was standing 3 feet away. She had been standing there for the entirety of this exchange. Mrs. Crane had not looked at her once. This was Eleanor understood the point. The most effective version of this particular cruelty was the one that treated the target as too beneath notice to address directly. She set her purchases on the counter. She paid for them. She picked up her package. Then she turned toward Mrs. Crane. "Mrs. Crane," she said pleasantly. "Good morning." The 3 women turned. There was a moment of recalibration, the particular flicker of adjustment that crosses a person's face when the thing they were discussing turns out to be listening. Mrs. Crane recovered fastest. "Miss Hayes," she said. "Cool, correct. I believe your tablecloth was the best work I have done this year," Eleanor said. "I hope it is wearing well." A beat. "Quite well," Mrs. Crane said with difficulty. "I'm glad." Eleanor picked up her basket. "I hope we'll see you at the gathering Saturday. Mr. Jonathan has been looking forward to it considerably." She smiled. Not warmly, precisely. The smile of a woman who has decided exactly where she stands. "Good morning." She walked out. Her heart was hammering the entire length of Market Street. She did not let it show until she turned the corner. Then she stood against the wall of the feed store and pressed her back against the warm brick and breathed. It was not a victory. She knew that. Mrs. Crane would recount the exchange to 6 people before noon, and the retelling would not favor Eleanor. But she had not been invisible. She had not been silent. She had looked Mrs. Crane in the face and spoken to her like a woman who had every right to be in that store and every right to speak. She had continued. The night before the gathering, she could not sleep. She lay in her room at the rooming house and stared at the ceiling and went over every possible version of what Saturday could become. Whitmore would be there. He would have a plan. He was not a man who entered a room without one. She thought about Jonathan, who would be visible to the county for the first time in 2 years. Who might have a good day or a difficult one. Who was, regardless of what day it turned out to be, still the most dignified person Eleanor had met in her life. She thought about William. She thought about the way he had looked at her 2 evenings ago, when she had made him laugh. A real laugh, surprised out of him by something she'd said about Mrs. Briggs's cat, and for a moment his face had been completely open, completely present, not managed at all. Just him. She pressed her hand against her sternum. She thought about what Jonathan had said. He will carry a thing for a very long time before he sets it down in front of someone. But he will set it down. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She told herself to sleep. She told herself it was practical. She told herself that tomorrow required everything she had, and she could not give everything she had if she spent the night at the ceiling. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she finally believed herself. Saturday arrived with the particular perfection that Virginia summers occasionally offered, heat that was warm rather than brutal, the kind that made everything look slightly golden around the edges. Eleanor arrived at Carter Estate at 7 in the morning to help with preparations. The household was already in motion. Mrs. Briggs had 3 additional women helping in the kitchen. Thomas was directing the arrangement of tables on the south lawn. Jonathan, to everyone's visible relief, was having a clear morning. He had dressed himself, come down to breakfast on time, and was currently telling Thomas exactly how the table arrangement had been done in 1802, and why that was still the superior configuration. William found her in the kitchen at 7:30. He looked for the first time since she had known him nervous. Not visibly. Someone who didn't know him would not have seen it, but she knew him now, knew the particular set of his jaw when he was managing something internal, the way his hands were slightly more still than usual because he was making them be. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like a woman about to walk into a room that wants her to disappear," she said. "You?" "Similarly," he said, which was probably the most honest thing he could have said. They stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Outside, Thomas and Jonathan were engaged in a spirited disagreement about the tables. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Briggs was telling someone to be careful with that. "Whatever happens today," William said, "I need you to know, don't," Eleanor said quietly. He stopped. "Don't tell me before," she said. "Tell me after, when it means more." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, quick and deep and very real. "All right," he said. She straightened her dress, picked up her basket. "Your father needs you to walk out there with him," she said, "and look like the man who runs this estate and always has. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She looked at him one more time. "So can I." The first carriage arrived at 10 o'clock. By noon, there were 40 people on the south lawn of Carter Estate, with more coming up the drive. And Charles Whitmore arrived at 12:30 with his daughter on his arm, and his eyes found Eleanor before they found anything else in that crowd. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had a plan. Eleanor looked back at him steadily. So did she. Charles Whitmore moved through the gathering, the way water moves through a crack in a wall, slowly, deliberately finding every weak point and pressing on it. Eleanor watched him from across the south lawn. He had been there 20 minutes, and already she could map his route by the small shifts in the crowd's posture. A cluster of men near the oak table tightened when he joined them. A group of women looked toward Eleanor almost involuntarily, after he leaned in and said something she couldn't hear. He was not loud today. He was not the direct gravitational force he'd been in William's study. He was something more careful, more precise. He was working the room, and he was very good at it. Caroline Whitmore stood beside her father, dressed in pale yellow, with the expression of a woman who had been coached to smile and was doing so faithfully. She was, Eleanor noted, genuinely. Pretty soft features, good posture, the practiced ease of a girl raised to enter rooms like this one. She was not unkind. That much was visible. She was simply a piece in her father's arrangement. Eleanor almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She turned away from Whitmore and went to find Jonathan. He was holding court near the garden wall, which was exactly where he'd said he intended to be. 3 men from neighboring estates had gathered around him with the slightly uncertain attention of people who had been told an old man was failing and had arrived to find him sharp, specific, and entirely in command of a story about the 1802 drought that had apparently ruined everyone's tobacco crop simultaneously. He was telling it well. He had the timing of a man who had told good stories his whole life and had not lost that particular skill. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the group. Jonathan saw her, and his expression warmed. "Gentlemen," he said without missing a beat, "this is Miss Eleanor Hayes. She is the finest seamstress in Richmond and a woman of very good sense. She has been keeping me honest all summer." The 3 men looked at her. 2 of them had the careful neutrality of people processing Whitmore's version of her against what they were actually seeing. The third, an older man with weathered hands and a direct gaze whom she recognized as Mr. Beaumont, a farmer with land to the north, nodded at her with something that looked like straightforward respect. "Miss Hayes," Mr. Beaumont said, "Jonathan tells me you walked him back to his driver in July." "I happened to be nearby," she said, "in the heat of the afternoon when half of Richmond was walking the other direction," Mr. Beaumont said. He had the blunt accuracy of a man who said what he observed. "That's not nothing." "It was the right thing to do," Eleanor said. "Most people would have done the same." "They didn't, though," Mr. Beaumont said. Jonathan was watching her with quiet satisfaction. "No," she said. "They didn't." She did not look toward Whitmore. She kept her eyes on the men in front of her, and she talked about the summer, about Jonathan, about nothing that required defense or explanation, just a woman having a normal conversation with normal people, which was all she had ever asked to do. The first 30 minutes passed. Then Whitmore made his move. He did it through Caroline. Eleanor saw it happen from across the lawn. Caroline approached William, who had been managing the gathering with the organized competence he brought to everything moving between groups, keeping the machinery of hospitality running, and said something that produced a polite, pained expression on his face. William looked toward his father, then toward Eleanor, then back at Caroline. He nodded, said something, smiled in the way a man smiles when he is doing a social duty. Then Whitmore himself appeared at William's elbow, and the three of them stood together, and it was a tableau that was visible from every point on the lawn. The Carter heir, the Whitmore family, and the implication of an alliance. Eleanor watched it. She kept her face entirely still. Next to her, Mr. Beaumont said, "Whitmore plans things." He didn't phrase it as a question. "He does," Eleanor said. "Always has." Beaumont watched the three figures across the lawn. "Used to play cards with him years ago. Never played a hand without knowing what he'd do 3 hands later." He glanced at Eleanor sideways. "You know what his weakness is?" She looked at him. "Tell me." "He plans for what people are afraid of," Beaumont said. "He doesn't plan for what people aren't." He tipped his hat slightly. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes. I'm going to go have a word with Jonathan about that drought. He's got the numbers wrong and it's bothering me." He walked away. Eleanor stood alone for a moment. She looked at William across the lawn. He was not looking at her. He was attending to his guests, doing what he needed to do, exactly as she'd told him to. He was playing his part. She looked at Whitmore. Whitmore was looking at her. He raised his glass slightly. A small gesture, almost courtly. She did not react at all. His eyes narrowed just a fraction. Good, she thought. It was Mrs. Aldina Crane who fired the opening shot of the afternoon's real battle, which surprised Eleanor only in its timing she had expected to have until after the meal. She was standing with 2 women she had not met before, wives of landowners from the eastern part of the county, when Mrs. Crane arrived at the edge of their group with the smooth, inevitable movement of a woman who had been waiting for a gap in the conversation. "Miss Hayes," she said, "I didn't see you arrive." "I've been here since this morning," Eleanor said, "helping with the preparations." "Of course." Mrs. Crane smiled at the 2 women beside Eleanor. "Miss Hayes is very present in the Carter household, as I'm sure you've heard." One of the women made a neutral sound. The other looked between Eleanor and Mrs. Crane with the expression of someone who could feel the quality of an exchange shifting. "I work here," Eleanor said simply. "Indeed." Mrs. Crane tilted her head. "It's interesting work for a seamstress, isn't it? I had always understood the role to be rather more circumscribed. Sewing, mending, household linens." A gentle pause. "Somehow your arrangement seems to have expanded considerably beyond that." "I also sit with Mr. Jonathan on difficult days," Eleanor said. "It helps him, if that's the expansion you mean." "I'm sure it does help him," Mrs. Crane said. "A lonely old man with a failing memory and a considerable estate." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'm sure it helps him enormously to have someone so attentive." The 2 women had gone very still. Eleanor felt the anger move through her like heat. Not the hot, blinding anger that makes people say things they regret. The cold, clear kind. The kind that sharpens everything down to a fine point. "Mrs. Crane," she said, "I have sewn for you, delivered on time, charged you fairly, and produced work you have complimented to my face. I have done nothing in this household except the work I was asked to do and the kindness I chose to offer. If you have a specific accusation, I'd ask you to make it plainly so I can answer it plainly. And if you don't, then I'd appreciate you not wasting either of our afternoons." The silence that followed was the kind that makes everyone within 10 feet pretend to be looking at something else. Mrs. Crane's face went through several things quickly. Surprise. Recalculation. A thin, cool anger of her own. "Well," she said. "Well," Eleanor agreed. Mrs. Crane left. The 2 women beside Eleanor were very quiet for a moment. Then the taller one said in a tone of genuine and slightly stunned admiration, "That was the bravest thing I have seen all summer." "Or the most foolish," Eleanor said honestly. "Sometimes they're the same thing," the woman said and offered her hand. Margaret Hartley. My husband farms north of the Beaumont land. I've heard about you, Miss Hayes. I'd like to form my own opinion if you don't mind. I'd prefer it, Eleanor said, and shook her hand. The meal was served at 2 o'clock, and it was during the meal that the afternoon shifted again. Whitmore had managed the seating not officially, but effectively the way a man with enough social influence can shape a room without appearing to. He had positioned himself 3 seats from William at the main table with Caroline between them, and the arrangement was visible and deliberate. A picture, a proposal made in furniture. Jonathan was at William's right hand, which was not negotiable, and which Whitmore had known better than to challenge. Eleanor had been placed at a side table with the Hartleys and Mr. Beaumont, and several other guests. She didn't know which was either an oversight or a calculated placement designed to make her invisible. She suspected the latter. She ate her meal and talked to Margaret Hartley, who turned out to be sharp and funny, and entirely unintimidated by the social architecture of the afternoon, and she kept one part of her attention on the main table, the way she always kept one part of her attention on the things that mattered. She saw the moment Whitmore leaned toward William and said something. She saw William's jaw set. She saw Jonathan put down his fork. She could not hear the exchange. She didn't need to. The geometry of it was clear enough. Whitmore pushing William, holding Jonathan, watching with the expression of a man who has recognized a threat and is deciding how to meet it. Then she saw Jonathan say something, and Whitmore smiled. That smile made the back of her neck cold. The answer came 40 minutes later when the meal had cleared and the gathering moved back to the lawn. Whitmore positioned himself at the center of the largest cluster of guests, and with the ease of a man who has done this before, brought the ambient conversation to a kind of natural focal point. Not a speech, not a declaration. Just a man with presence and volume and a room that had been prepared to listen to him. I want to say something, Whitmore said, about this family. He said it warmly, affectionately even. Several people nodded. Jonathan Carter, Whitmore said, is one of the finest men this county has produced. His estate, his family, his influence on this community, we all owe him a debt. He paused. Which is precisely why those of us who care about this family have a responsibility to speak plainly when we see something that concerns us. The lawn had gone quiet. Not silent, there were still sounds. People shifting a glass being set down, but the quality of attention had focused. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd and felt the shape of what was coming. A man in Mr. Jonathan's condition, Whitmore said carefully, gently, as though every word cost him something, is vulnerable. That is simply the truth. And when a person of uncertain position inserts herself into a vulnerable man's daily life and into his household and into the confidence of his family, he shook his head slowly. I think we all understand what I'm describing. Several heads turned. Toward Eleanor. Not all of them, but enough. I am not making accusations, Whitmore said. I am raising concerns, as a neighbor, as a friend of this family. He looked at William, as someone who wants only the best for the Carter name. The silence held. Eleanor could feel it on her skin, the weight of 40 people deciding what they thought, how much they believed him, whether the story he was telling fit the evidence they'd been gathering all afternoon. She could feel the work of the last 3 hours balanced on this moment, every conversation, every direct word, every time she had simply refused to disappear. She looked at William. He was already looking at her. His face was completely still, the way it got when he was making a decision. She gave him the smallest nod. It was not permission. It was recognition. The nod of one person to another before something that cannot be undone. William stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The gathering had been quiet since Whitmore started speaking, and it stayed quiet when William moved to stand where everyone could see him, because William Carter was the name on the gate at the end of the drive, and 40 people had come to his estate, and they were going to listen to what he said. I want to thank Mr. Whitmore, William said, for his concern. Whitmore inclined his head. My father's health is a matter I take seriously, William said. It always has been. I appreciate everyone here who has asked after him today, and I want to say clearly that he is well better than he has been in over a year, and that this estate is managed soundly, and has been at every point." A murmur. Positive. Several people nodded. "I also want to say something about Miss Eleanor Hayes." The lawn went completely still. Eleanor stopped breathing. "Miss Hayes came to the attention of this family because she stopped on a road in July, when my father was confused and alone, and every other person on that road walked past him." William's voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided exactly what he meant to say and was saying it. She did not know who he was. She did not know this family. She had no reason to stop except that it was the right thing to do. He paused. "She has worked in this household with skill and honesty. She has been a source of genuine comfort to my father on difficult days. She has conducted herself with more dignity than she has been shown by some members of this county." His eyes moved very briefly to Mrs. Crane. "And she has not once asked for anything she was not owed." Another pause. Shorter. "Mr. Whitmore has implied that Miss Hayes's presence in our household is something to be concerned about. I want to be plain, it is not. She is here because this family values her. She is here because my father asked her to be. And she is here because I have come to understand over the course of this summer that a person's worth is not measured by the house they were born in or the name they carry." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "It is measured by what they do when no one is watching, and I have watched Miss Hayes. I know what I have seen." He stopped. The lawn was absolutely quiet. Whitmore's expression had gone through careful changes while William spoke, starting with the confidence of a man watching a planned move fail, landing somewhere that was not quite anger and not quite calculation, but some compound of both. Caroline Whitmore was looking at her father with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read. Mr. Beaumont from somewhere in the crowd said, "Hear, hear," in a clear, dry voice. Two other men echoed it. Then Margaret Hartley. Then her husband. Then three more voices Eleanor didn't recognize. It was not applause. It was not a triumph. It was the sound of a room deciding person by person which version of the story they believed. Whitmore smiled again. The smile was different now, thinner. "Well said, Carter," he said smoothly. "Well said. No one doubts your loyalty to your household." He made it sound like a concession. Eleanor heard what it actually was, a retreat to prepared ground. Whitmore did not lose cleanly. He repositioned. "Loyalty is one thing," Whitmore added pleasantly. "Judgment is another. And I think we can all agree that a man in certain circumstances may sometimes see things differently than those around him." His eyes moved to Jonathan. "No offense intended to your father." And there it was. The real move. Not Eleanor. Never really Eleanor. Eleanor had been the distraction. The actual target was Jonathan's credibility, and by extension, William's judgment in deferring to it. Jonathan Carter stood up. He did it slowly because his joints required it. But he stood fully with the complete, unhurried authority of a man who had built everything around him and knew it. The conversation around him stopped. People stepped back slightly instinctively, the way you step back when something with genuine weight enters a space. Jonathan looked at Whitmore. "Charles," he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely clear. "I have known you for 30 years. Whitmore held his gaze. "You have Jonathan. I know your father cheated mine out of 20 acres of bottomland in 1789, Jonathan said pleasantly. "I have never mentioned it because it was a long time ago, and your father is dead, and the land has been yours long enough that arguing the point would serve no one." He paused. "I mention it now only to establish that I know you, Charles. I have always known you." The lawn was extraordinarily quiet. "A man questioning whether I know my own mind," Jonathan said, "is a man who wants my mind to be in question. I understand why that would be useful to you." He looked around the gathered crowd, neighbors, farmers' men whose fathers had worked beside his father, women whose families had been woven into this county for generations. I am 71 years old. My memory has its difficult days. I will not pretend otherwise. He stood straight. But I know this woman. I know what she did on that road. I know what she has been to this household. And I know the difference between a person who cares about my family and a person who cares about my estate. He looked back at Whitmore. I believe, Jonathan said, that you know the difference too. Whitmore said nothing. The silence held for 3 full seconds. In a crowd of 40 people, 3 seconds of absolute silence is a very long time. Then Mr. Beaumont laughed. Not cruelly. The laugh of a man who has heard something he agrees with and doesn't see any reason to pretend otherwise. Several others followed. The gathering did not erupt. It did not transform into something celebratory. It simply shifted. The way a room shifts when a door opens and the air changes. People turned back to their conversations. The main cluster around Whitmore dispersed naturally in the way of people who have somewhere else to be. Caroline Whitmore quietly detached from her father's side and walked toward the refreshment table. Whitmore stood where he was for a moment. Then he set down his glass with great care and said something to the man nearest him that Eleanor couldn't hear. Then he walked toward Jonathan. Eleanor's entire body tensed. William moved at the same moment, stepping forward, positioning himself slightly between Whitmore and his father, not aggressively but clearly. Whitmore stopped 3 feet away. You were always better at this than me, Jonathan, he said. He said it quietly, and Eleanor, standing close enough to hear, could not entirely determine whether it was concession or threat or some careful blending of both. At what? Jonathan said. At making people feel like the right thing and the easy thing are the same thing. A pause. They rarely are. No, Jonathan agreed. They rarely are. That's the point. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, then at William, then finally at Eleanor. She held his gaze. He nodded. A single precise inclination of his head, not concession, not apology, something more like acknowledgement. The recognition of one player to another that a round has been played and the result has been recorded. Then he turned and walked toward the drive. He did not say goodbye to his host. He did not collect his daughter. Caroline Eleanor saw was talking with Margaret Hartley near the refreshment table and did not appear to be in a hurry. He simply walked to where his horse was waiting mounted and rode down the drive without looking back. The gathering breathed again. Eleanor let out a slow breath. William appeared at her elbow. Are you all right? He said. I'm not certain yet, she said honestly. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's fair. They stood beside each other for a moment, not touching, not saying anything else, just standing in the same space in the aftermath of something that had been, in its own way, a kind of battle. Your father, she said. I know. What he said about the bottomland has been true for 30 years, William said. He just never said it out loud before. She looked at Jonathan, who had sat back down and was accepting a glass of lemonade from Thomas, with the satisfied expression of a man who has done something he had been waiting to do for quite some time. He enjoyed that, she said. He absolutely did, William said. The gathering wound down through the late afternoon guests, departing in ones and twos, with the particular warmth of an event that had been more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Mr. Beaumont shook Eleanor's hand before he left, and told her she was welcome at the Beaumont farm any time. Margaret Hartley embraced her and said she would be in touch about some curtain work. 3 other women who had arrived as strangers left as something closer to acquaintances. Caroline Whitmore was the last guest to go. She had stayed long after her father's departure, talking with various people, and Eleanor had watched her with a complicated kind of attention throughout the afternoon. This girl, who had been placed on a lawn like a piece in a game, and had spent the afternoon quietly deciding she didn't want to be a piece. She came to Eleanor just before her carriage was brought around. Miss Hayes, she said. Miss Whitmore. Caroline looked at her with an expression that was direct and slightly uncomfortable and entirely genuine. I want you to know that I had no part in what my father has been doing, she said. I was aware of it. I did not stop it. A pause. I should have. Eleanor looked at her. You had very little standing to stop it, she said. Less than you might think, Caroline said, which is its own kind of problem. She was quiet for a moment. He will not come back here, she said. Not after today. His pride won't allow it. I know, Eleanor said. He will find other ways to express his disapproval. Caroline's voice was careful. He is a man who does not forget. I know that too, Eleanor said. Caroline stopped. I wanted to say it, that I know what he did was wrong, and that I'm sorry I didn't say so sooner. Eleanor looked at this girl with her yellow dress and her difficult father and her quiet, honest regret, and felt the particular complicated warmth of a woman recognizing another woman doing the best she can with what she's been given. Thank you, Eleanor said. For saying it now. Caroline nodded, turned to go, then stopped. For whatever it's worth, she said without looking back, he's a good man, William Carter. Better than he knows how to show most days. She glanced over her shoulder. Don't let him be alone with it too long. Men like that have a way of convincing themselves that carrying everything alone is the same as strength. Then she walked to her carriage and was gone. Eleanor stood there for a moment with Carolyn Whitmore's words sitting in her chest. Behind her she heard William's footsteps. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself 3 seconds. She always gave herself 3 seconds when she needed to be steady, and then she turned. He was standing close enough that she could see the weariness in his face that the afternoon had cost him, and the something else underneath it. The thing she had been watching build all summer, careful brick by careful brick in the spaces between what they said and what they didn't. You said, she said quietly, I have watched Miss Hayes. I know what I have seen. I did, he said. What did you see? He looked at her for a long moment. The evening was coming on now, the summer light going golden, and the lawn was nearly empty, and the house behind them was settling into the particular quiet of a large gathering's end. Everything, he said. I saw everything, Eleanor. Her given name. Deliberate this time. Not accidental. She looked at him. You said you'd tell me after, he said. That whatever you wanted to say, you'd say it when it meant more. He held her gaze. It's after. She stood still. The evening was quiet around them. The mockingbird somewhere in the garden had started up again, the same bird she was almost certain that had been singing the afternoon she'd first come here, running through every song it knew. I don't want you to say it because today was hard, she said. I know, he said, and I don't want you to say it because your father would be pleased. I know, he said again. I'm not saying it for either of those reasons. Then why? Because it's true, he said simply. And I have been carrying it for 3 months, and I am very tired of carrying things without setting them down. Eleanor looked at him. This serious, careful, complicated man who had spent 20 years building walls around everything that mattered to him, and had spent one summer quietly and without planning it, letting her walk right through them. All right, she said softly. Say it then. He took one step toward her. Just one. Enough to close the distance that had always been between them, not eliminate it, but cross it. Enough to be standing in her space rather than the careful, measured distance of employer and employee of different names and different standings, and all the architecture that said they were supposed to remain on separate sides of something. I love you, he said. I don't know when it started. I know that you stopped on a road when you didn't have to. I know that you sat with my father through things I couldn't. I know that you stood on this lawn today and did not move and did not flinch and were exactly, completely, entirely yourself. His voice was quiet and steady and without performance, and I know that I would rather face every difficult thing in front of me with you standing next to me than face an easy life with anyone else. The mockingbird sang. The evening light held. Eleanor Hayes, who had been invisible for so long that she had nearly stopped expecting to be seen, stood in the summer air of Carter Estate and looked at this man who had watched her and known her and chosen her, not despite who she was, but because of it. She pressed her hand against his chest. His heart was not steady at all. Good, she thought. Neither was hers. "I love you too," she said. "I reckon I have for a while." He put his hand over hers, warm and real and entirely present. Neither of them moved for a long moment. They didn't need to. The work wasn't finished. Whitmore was still out there. The county still had its opinions. The road ahead had no shortage of difficult things to navigate. Eleanor's rent was still due. The back, clients were still gone. The space between her position and his still had real and complicated dimensions that would not disappear because two people had decided to be honest with each other in a garden. But they were standing together. And the evening was long, and for the first time in as long as Eleanor could remember, that felt like enough. The days after the gathering moved differently. Eleanor noticed it first in small things. The way Thomas tipped his hat to her when she arrived each morning, not the polite, cautious acknowledgement of a servant, uncertain about a new employee's standing, but the easy, natural gesture of a man greeting someone who belonged. The way Mrs. Briggs stopped explaining where things were kept in the kitchen and started simply handing them to her, assuming correctly that she knew. The way the household settled around her presence, the way water settles around a stone, not fighting it, not making room for it, just including it. Something had been decided at the gathering, not announced, not declared, just settled the way things settle in communities where everyone understands that a public moment has changed the shape of things, even if no one says so plainly. What had not settled was Whitmore. Eleanor had known he wouldn't disappear. Caroline had told her as much. A man like Whitmore did not lose a room and go home and revise his position. He went home and reconsidered his methods. She found out what the new method was on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the gathering, when William arrived at the estate from town with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression that told her the paper contained something he had not wanted to find. She was sitting with Jonathan in the morning room when William came in. He looked at his father first the way he always did, checking, assessing, doing the unconscious arithmetic of how Jonathan seemed today against how Jonathan had seemed yesterday. Jonathan was having a good morning. He was working on a letter to a cousin in Georgia with the careful concentration of a man who knew his good hours were worth using. William looked at Eleanor. He held up the paper. She excused herself from Jonathan and followed William into the hall. "He's filed a formal complaint," William said, "with the county clerk, citing concerns about undue influence over a person of diminished capacity." He handed her the paper. "My father is the person of diminished capacity." Eleanor read it. She read it twice. Her jaw tightened. "He's claiming that any financial arrangements made by my father in the last year, including any changes to estate documents, may be subject to review due to his condition." William's voice was controlled. She had learned to hear what that control covered. Right now, it covered fury. "He's also named you specifically as a person of interest in any such review." "He wants to invalidate your father's legal authority," Eleanor said. "He wants to make a case that my father cannot be trusted to make decisions, which would shift full management authority to other arrangements." William looked at her directly. "Arrangements he would have considerably more influence over." Eleanor set the paper down on the hall table. She had been expecting something. She had not expected this. This was not a man threatening her reputation or her employment. This was a man reaching for an old man's legal standing, using Jonathan's illness as a lever to pry open the Carter estate from the inside. "Does your father know?" she said. "Not yet." "Tell him," she said immediately. William looked at her. "He'll be upset. He'll be furious," she said. "And he has every right to be. And he is sharp enough today to understand it and to help you think through it." She held William's gaze. "Do not protect him from this by keeping him out of it. He is not a child." William was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. "You're right," he said. "Also, Eleanor said, you need your solicitor here by tomorrow." "I've already sent word." "Good." She looked at the paper on the table. "What does the complaint actually require?" "A response within 30 days. a formal statement of Mr. Jonathan Carter's competency witnessed and signed by a physician and 2 persons of standing in the county. "Mr. Beaumont," Eleanor said instantly. "I was thinking the same. And Dr. Marsh has been seeing your father for 8 months. He knows the difference between a man with memory difficulties and a man who cannot manage his own affairs." She looked at William. "This is going to be unpleasant." "Yes. Whitmore is going to make it public." "He already has," William said. "The complaint is a matter of county record as of yesterday morning." Eleanor absorbed that. The thing about a county record was that it could be read by anyone who walked into the clerk's office and asked, which meant that by now the outline of what Whitmore had done was already moving through Richmond on the same invisible current that had carried everything else all summer. "Then we don't try to keep it quiet," she said. William looked at her. "If we respond quietly, it looks like we're managing something we're ashamed of," she said. "We respond clearly, publicly. We let people see your father and let them form their own conclusions, the same as the gathering but more direct." "You want to put my father in front of the county," William said. "I want your father to put himself in front of the county," she said. "There's a difference, and I think if you ask him, he'll want to." "Dag," they told Jonathan together. William sat across from his father and laid the document on the table between them without preamble. Because Eleanor had been right, Jonathan Carter was not a man who benefited from being managed around difficult information. He was a man who had built 30 years of sound decisions on his ability to face things clearly. Jonathan read the document without speaking. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. 30 years, he said. His voice was absolutely quiet. I gave that man 30 years of neighborly patience. I never once called his father a cheat to his face, though everyone in the county knew it. He stopped. And he uses my own mind against me. Yes, William said. Jonathan looked at Eleanor. This is your fault, he said. She blinked. If you hadn't been so obviously completely and inconveniently decent, Jonathan said, he wouldn't have needed to escalate. The corner of his mouth moved. I consider that a compliment. Eleanor let out a breath. I'll take it as one. What's the response? Jonathan said, turning back to William. Businesslike now. Direct. The mind of a man who built things. William laid out what Eleanor had suggested. Jonathan listened without interrupting, which was how Eleanor knew he was thinking hard. Jonathan in conversation always had something to add, but Jonathan working through a problem went very quiet. Beaumont will sign, Jonathan said when William finished. He told me at the gathering he'd had enough of Whitmore's games 20 years ago, and Dr. Marsh is a man of principle. He tapped the table. What about the clerk's office? We file the response formally, William said. A full statement of your capacity witnessed on record. And publicly, Jonathan said. Eleanor suggested. Eleanor is right, Jonathan said. He looked at her with an expression that was warm and decided and carried underneath it something that looked like the specific pride of a man watching someone he believed in do exactly what he'd believed they would do. We don't hide. We never should have from the beginning. He straightened in his chair. I'd like to move quickly, William said. Before Whitmore can. Tomorrow, Jonathan said. Get Beaumont here tomorrow. Get Marsh here tomorrow. He looked at his son. And William. Yes. I want to write the statement myself, Jonathan said. Not the solicitor. Not you. Me. His voice was firm. Whitmore is questioning my mind. My words are the answer. William looked at his father for a long moment. Yes, sir, he said quietly. The statement Jonathan Carter wrote took him 3 hours. Eleanor sat with him while he wrote it, not helping, not reading over his shoulder, just present the way she had learned to be present. He worked slowly and carefully and crossed out things and rewrote them, and twice he put the pen down and sat in silence for several minutes, and each time he picked it up again. When he finished, he read it back to himself. Then he read it again. Then he handed it to Eleanor without a word. She read it. It was 4 paragraphs. Plain language. No oratory, no performance. The kind of writing that comes from a man who knows exactly what he means and has spent too long being careful about saying it. He described his condition honestly, the difficult days, the confusion, the grief of feeling something slip. He did not minimize it. He did not dress it up. Then he described what he knew. He knew his estate. He knew his son. He knew the woman who had stopped on a summer road when no one else had, and who had sat beside him through 60 mornings of good days and bad ones, and had never once treated him as a burden or an opportunity, but only as a person. He knew he wrote the difference between a man who wanted what was his and a man who wanted what was someone else's. He knew which kind of man had filed the complaint. And he knew this was the last paragraph, and Eleanor read it twice, that a man who could still write these words, who still knew the faces of the people he loved, and the shape of the land he had built, and the difference between right and wrong, when he encountered both, was not a man whose judgment needed to be questioned. Only a man who was afraid of that judgment he wrote would try. Eleanor looked up from the paper. "Mr. Jonathan," she said. He was watching her. "Well, this is the finest thing I have ever read," she said. His jaw worked for a moment. He looked away toward the window. "My wife would have written it better," he said. "Maybe," Eleanor said. "But you wrote it." He was quiet. Then, "Have William take it to Beaumont tonight. I want it signed and filed before the end of the week." "I'll tell him." She stood to go. Jonathan caught her hand. She looked down at him. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I want you to know something." He held her gaze with the clear, direct attention of a good day. "This family has been missing something for a long time. Something I couldn't name, and William didn't know to look for." He squeezed her hand once. "I know what it was now." Her throat tightened. "Mr. Jonathan, don't," he said gently. "Let me say it." He looked at her. "It was someone who didn't need anything from us, who stopped on a road because it was right, and stayed because she wanted to, and fought because she believed it was worth fighting for." He let go of her hand. "That's what was missing. That's what you are." Eleanor stood very still. "Go find William," Jonathan said. "He needs to take this to Beaumont tonight." She nodded. She did not trust her voice entirely. She found William in the study. Oh, he knew before she said anything. He saw her face when she came in, and he stood up from his desk and crossed the room in 4 steps, and when he put his hands on her shoulders, she let herself lean into that for exactly 1 moment. One honest, exhausted, entirely human moment, before she straightened and handed him the paper. He read it. She watched his face while he read. Watched the careful management give way the way it did now when they were alone, not collapse. Nothing about William Carter collapsed but open. The way a hand opens when it finally puts something down. When he finished, he held the paper carefully, as though the weight of it was real. "I'll ride to Beaumont tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "It won't end with this," he said. "Even if the filing is solid and the statement holds and the complaint is dismissed, Whitmore will find another angle." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her. "Are you tired?" The question was so simple and so direct that it caught her off guard. She thought about it honestly. About the summer's worth of walking into rooms that didn't want her and standing her ground. About the merchants and Mrs. Crane and the petition and the county record. About every morning she had arrived at this estate and chosen again to continue. "Yes," she said. "I'm very tired." "So am I," he said. They stood with that for a moment. 2 tired people who had been holding things up for a long time, standing in a room together, not pretending otherwise. "Eleanor?" he said. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it doesn't change anything about your position here, or my father's regard for you, or anything else. I need you to know that before I ask." She looked at him. "All right." He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a speech, not a declaration. 5 words plainly spoken by a man who had already said the important things and was now saying this one. Eleanor looked at him. This man who had tested her and come to know her and stood in front of 40 people and said, "I have watched Miss Hayes. I know what I have seen." This man whose father had become her family before she'd even realized it was happening. This man who was tired the same way she was tired, and who had just asked her the most significant question of her life, with the same directness he brought to everything that actually mattered to him. "I need to know something first," she said. "All right. Not because I doubt you," she said, "but because I've spent my whole life making decisions based on what I needed to survive, and this is the first decision I've ever been able to make based on what I actually want. So I need to be certain." "Ask," he said. "Do you understand what you're taking on?" she said. "Not me as I am now, not the summer version of this where everything is clear. The real version. My back rent and my lost clients and my rooming house and the fact that every person in this county who is on Whitmore's side will use me against you for years." She held his gaze. "I am not a convenient choice, William. I have nothing but myself to bring to this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said, "you stopped on a road when no one else did. You told me the truth when I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. You sat with my father through the worst of it without flinching. You stood on my lawn in front of 40 people and were completely entirely yourself." He took a step toward her. "You are the only person I have ever met who made me feel that who I was mattered more than what I managed." His voice was quiet and certain. "You brought everything. You brought the only thing that matters." The study was very quiet. Outside, the evening had come on fully, and the first of the summer crickets had started up in the garden. "Yes," Eleanor said. He stilled. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "I'll marry you." He exhaled. It was a long breath, and it carried in it something she recognized, the sound of a person setting down a weight they had been carrying so long they'd forgotten what it felt like without it. He reached out and took her hand, turned it over, pressed her palm flat against his. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "You should go to Beaumont tonight." He made a sound that was entirely unguardedly a laugh. "I should," he agreed. "The complaint doesn't wait because I know." He squeezed her hand. "I know." He looked at her. "When I come back, I'll be here," she said. He went. Odd. The response to Whitmore's complaint was filed 4 days later. Jonathan Carter's statement, signed by Dr. Marsh and witnessed by Mr. Beaumont and 2 other landowners, was entered into the county record on a Friday morning. The solicitor handled the formal components. William was present. Jonathan insisted on being present as well, and arrived at the clerk's office with Thomas at his side and his best coat on, and the particular expression of a man attending to important business. The county clerk read the statement. He read the supporting documentation. He looked at Jonathan Carter, who looked back at him with 71 years of clear-eyed authority. The clerk stamped the filing. Whitmore's complaint was formally answered. It was not over. Eleanor had known it wouldn't be over. A formal answer and a dismissal were different things, and the road between them was still long. But the immediate pressure had lifted. The 30-day clock had been met, the record had been answered, and what Whitmore had tried to do in secret was now equally a matter of public record on both sides. What happened next was something Eleanor had not entirely predicted. Mr. Beaumont told his wife about the statement. His wife told 3 women at church on Sunday. Those 3 women, it turned out, had each had their own accumulation of experiences with Charles Whitmore's management of county opinion over the years. The statement and the story behind it traveled through the county not as gossip, but as something else, as a reckoning, as the specific satisfaction of watching a man who had arranged things to his liking for a long time encounter something he could not arrange. By the end of the following week, 2 of Eleanor's former clients had written to ask if she was still taking work. She wrote back and said she was. The morning that changed everything came 3 weeks after the filing on a clear September day, when the heat had finally broken, and the air smelled like something different was coming. Jonathan was having one of his harder days. Not lost, he knew who and where he was, and the fog was partial rather than complete, but slower. More careful. The kind of day when he stayed close to the house and let the world come to him rather than going out to meet it. Eleanor was sitting with him after breakfast when he said without any preamble, "I want to see it done before I get worse." She looked at him. "See what done?" "The wedding," he said. He said it as though it were obvious. "I am having more good days than bad ones right now. That will shift eventually. I want to see my son married to the right person while I can still be present for it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing to ask." "No?" he agreed. "It isn't. I'm asking it anyway." She looked at her hands. She thought about William. About the question he'd asked and the answer she'd given, and the 3 weeks since which had been full of the complicated practical necessary work of figuring out what came next. The conversations with the solicitor, the adjustments to various estate documents, the delicate navigation of what their engagement meant for people who needed to be informed. It had not yet been announced publicly. They had agreed to wait until the complaint was formally resolved. To not give Whitmore another angle. The complaint was resolved. "I'll talk to William," she said. Jonathan nodded. Then, with the timing she had come to love in him. "Also, the wedding should be outside. Your mother would have wanted it outside." She blinked. "You didn't know my mother." "No," he agreed. "But I know you, and I know what you would want, and I think she would have agreed." He smiled at her. The real one. The one she'd worked hard to earn. "I'm right about these things." "You're occasionally right about these things." "I'm consistently right about these things," he said. "Ask William." She found William in the south field. He was standing at the edge of the tree line near the old oak tree, near his mother's grave. He heard her coming. She'd stopped trying to be quiet when she approached him outdoors, because he always heard her anyway, and he turned before she reached him. She stopped beside him. They stood together for a moment without speaking, looking at the oak tree, with its long spread of old branches, and the small, simple stone at its base. "I come here when I need to think," he said. "I know," she said. "Thomas told me." "Thomas tells you everything." "He trusts me." William looked at the stone. "I used to come here and feel guilty," he said, "for not being able to talk to her, for being the kind of person who can't talk to gravestones." A pause. "Now I come here, and I just miss her, which is simpler." He glanced at Eleanor. "You did that." "I didn't do anything. You let me talk about her," he said, "without making it into a project of grief or a thing to manage. You just listened." He looked at her. "She would have liked you." "Your father told me the same thing." "My father is right about these things." She laughed. "That's what he said." William smiled. The full one. The one that had taken her the better part of the summer to get to, and which still caught her off guard every time, because it changed his whole face, took everything careful and controlled, and opened it up into what was underneath, which was a man who was genuinely, warmly, completely present. "He came to see me this morning," William said, "before you arrived." "Did he?" "He had thoughts about timing." William looked at her. "He said he wants to see it done." "He said the same to me," Eleanor said, and... She looked at him. At this man who had asked her a question 3 weeks ago with 5 words, and who was now asking the same question again with 1. "October," she said, "before the weather turns." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face, the same thing she'd seen in him before in the study, when he'd exhaled the long breath of a man putting something down. But deeper this time. Fuller. "October," he said. "Outside," she added. "Your father has opinions about that." "My father has opinions about everything. He's usually right." "He's occasionally right," William said. And when she laughed again, he reached for her hand, and she gave it to him. And they stood at the edge of the tree line in the September morning, under the old oak tree, with the stone at their feet and the light coming through the leaves. The wedding was in October. Not a grand affair. Not the kind of event that required weeks of preparation and a guest list managed like a military campaign. Eleanor had never wanted that, and William, when she'd said so, had agreed with a relief so visible it made her smile. They were married on a Saturday on the south lawn of Carter Estate, with the oak tree visible at the edge of the field, and the October light doing everything that Virginia October light does, warm and slanted and golden, in a way that makes even ordinary things look like they matter. The guests were the people who had earned the right to be there. The Beaumonts, the Hartleys, Dr. Marsh, Thomas and Mrs. Briggs and the household, a handful of others who had been present at the gathering and who had made their positions clear in the weeks since. Mr. Beaumont walked Eleanor to where William was standing because Jonathan had asked him to, and because Eleanor had said yes without hesitation, and because some things are right without needing much explanation. Jonathan Carter stood beside his son. He was having a good day. One of the best days of the month, in fact, clear and present, and wearing his best coat, and his expression of a man who had arranged exactly what he intended to arrange and was deeply satisfied about it. He stood straight. He did not lean on Thomas. When Eleanor reached them, Jonathan looked at her with an expression that did not have a single name, but contained several things at once: love and pride, and the specific quality of relief that belongs to someone who has been waiting a long time for something right to happen and has finally seen it. "You look like her," he said quietly as she came to stand beside William. She knew who he meant. "Good," she said. He nodded, turned forward. The ceremony was simple, and it was true, and it took exactly as long as it needed to take, which was not very long, because William Carter and Eleanor Hayes had already said the important things to each other, and what remained was the formal acknowledgement of what had already been decided. When it was done, and William looked at her with the full, open, unmanaged expression she had spent an entire summer learning to produce from him, she thought about a road in July. About a man standing alone in the summer dust, while every person with better shoes and better names walked around him. About the 3 seconds she had given herself before she stopped. She had not stopped because she expected anything. She had stopped because it was right. Because the alternative, continuing like everyone else, like the sensible thing, had not been possible for the person she was. And this man, this family, this lawn, this name, she was taking on this life that was opening up in front of her, like a door she had not known existed. This was not the reward for stopping. It was what happened when a person was completely, entirely, stubbornly themselves. When they refused invisibility. When they continued, even when continuing was the harder thing, the costly thing, the thing that brought Whitmore and Mrs. Crane and petition and all the rest of it. They continued, and the world rearranged itself around their continuance. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes for the people who held on. Jonathan's hand found hers. She held it. On her other side, William's hand found hers too. She stood between these two men who had become her family, the father she had helped find his way home, the son who had helped her find hers. And the October sun came through the old oak tree, and the mockingbird somewhere in the garden ran through every song it knew. Eleanor Hayes Carter, a woman who had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. She was seen now. She was seen completely, and she was not letting go.